Hey Axis and Allies players, the good captain here. Welcome to video number 6 in my Axis and Allies 1914 series. This video will cover France. France is the fourth in turn sequence order to go, and despite the two most powerful Central Powers players having gone before it, it's very likely that France's initial setup is untouched. So let's jump right into it and go to what I think is the best first turn purchase for France. This power starts with 24 IPCs, and I think the best first turn purchase is 8 infantry. Not only do I think is an all infantry build best on the first turn, I think it's something France should be doing at least until turn 6, 7, or 8. I think there's a good argument for never building anything other than infantry for France, but I'll talk more about that purchase philosophy later in the video. Compared to the other Entente powers at the start of the game, France will very likely be in the unique position of having both the strongest land army in Europe at the beginning of the game as well as the strongest navy. This is assuming, of course, that the Germans attacked both Sea Zone 9 and Sea Zone 2 successfully. So I think it's best to split the discussion into two parts. First, we'll discuss the French army in mainland Europe, and then we'll discuss the French navy and French naval options. And by extension, we'll also cover what to do with the French assets in Africa. So just a brief review of what we have going on out here on the West Front. I feel very strongly, and it's been my experience, that Germany attacks Belgium on the first turn. So it's highly likely that when you get to France's first turn, you'll be looking like this out on the West Front. It may not be exactly like this, but it really doesn't matter. My moves are generally still the same. So the first thing I like to do is push as many pieces as I can into Lorraine. So now we've got 18 infantry and 6 artillery, and we're going to go ahead and reinforce that with the fighter from Paris. Next, we're going to have the infantry in Bordeaux move to Burgundy. We're going to have the infantry from Brest move to Picardy. We're going to have 1 infantry from Paris move to Picardy, and then the rest are going to move into Burgundy. I like the consolidation of all these French assets up in the Lorraine. This helps to put a lot of pressure both on Belgium and Alsace for round 2. We've got a solid and safe supply line here with 6 more infantry and 2 artillery coming up front. So I think this move is fairly intuitive. I don't think there's much to discuss there. But I am going to take a pause and talk about Picardy, and namely why I put 2 infantry in here. And the specific discussion I'm going to have here is how to set up blockers in Axis and Allies 1914. So just to define blocker very quickly, in other versions of Axis and Allies, this is when you take a single piece, usually an infantry, and leave it in a territory so that that territory can't be picked up for free or blitzed by your opponent. So the intuitive move here might be to just leave a single infantry in Picardy and have 7 infantry in Burgundy. But unless the value of the territory is a single IPC, I generally shy away from leaving a single infantry to defend any territory. My favorite number is 2, and I'm going to explain why. What is usually intuitive for an opponent seeking to capture a territory that's occupied by 1 infantry is to send 2 infantry and 1 artillery in. There's an 83% chance that the attacker in this case would clear the territory, and of course there's a 50% chance they take a loss when they do it. The biggest turnoff for me, and the reason I never send in 2 infantry and an artillery to clear a territory, is because of the value of the pieces that you sent in there. To send in a force like this is 10 IPCs. You are going to kill 3 IPCs and take 2 from your enemy. But in many, if not most cases, the counterattack option for your opponent is 100%. In other words, he can completely crush all those assets almost at 100% certainty, take the territory back. So now what looked and felt natural to do ended up being more costly. Let me reset this and show you what I would do in this case. Outside of not attacking at all, what I would do instead is send in 2 infantry. 2 infantry have a 55% chance of scoring 1 hit, and whether the defender hits on his return fire or not, this territory is now contested. In other words, worst case scenario, your opponent will still have to send in assets if they want the value of the territory on their turn. As the attacker, this also has the benefit of not having an artillery exposed to destruction. This means the defender is less incentivized to simply move his whole army in there. And overall, I feel that when it comes to the defender's next turn, things are less clear on what to do. Okay, I've gone ahead and reset the board to my opening moves for France to show how I diffuse this whole thing from ever happening, and that's by using 2 infantry. Instead of sending 2 infantry and an artillery for an 83%, you'd now have to send 4 infantry and 2 artilleries to get that same percentage. I would advise against using more than 2. This is because, paradoxically, using 3 or more can actually incentivize an attack to occur. In other words, if an attacking army is large enough, they might see that as an opportunity to destroy part of the defending army. So that's why I like to just keep it at 2. We'll now move to a discussion around short and mid-range goals. I feel that realistic early and mid-game goals for the French out on the West Front are to push the Germans out of Belgium at least, and get your army into Alsace at most. The Germans will very likely be feeding the East Front to make sure Russia goes down, and this is an early game opportunity for the French to take up some ground. And during this period of time, I recommend very strongly not engaging in any big pitched battle. If one is going to happen, let it be the Germans that attack you, and make sure that if they do so, it's to their detriment. In other words, make sure you have more pieces and more pips on your dice than they do. Because not only is the French army the largest on mainland Europe at the beginning of the game for the Entente, but we want to carry that fact into the mid and end game as well. Reinforcements from the British and Americans are coming. There's no need to take that kind of risk right now. And finally, one other early/mid-game goal is to keep the Italians propped up. The Italians are the weakest power on this board. They start out with only 14 IPCs, and so they're going to need more bodies up in Venice by turn 3, 4, or 5. And the only player at this point in the game that's in a position to do anything about it is France. So I like to send about 2 infantry a turn from Paris to Burgundy to Piedmont and Venice, and I like to keep them kind of streaming up here in a 2 infantry snake. But that's not the only way these Italy-bound French infantry are going to help win the war. After the first 3 or 4 turns, it's very likely that the Entente will have gained naval dominance in the Mediterranean. And as you'll soon see, having access to French infantry in Piedmont makes the French Navy down here quite lethal. So on that note, let's move now and discuss what to do with the French Navy. The French turn 1 naval moves are going to be heavily influenced by what the Central Powers navies did and how well they did it. The board state I have set up here assumes that the Austro-Hungarians have pushed Sea Zone 17, hit no mines, and made no attacks. The German U-boats hit Sea Zone 2 and cleared it with 1 boat remaining, and the Germans attacked Sea Zone 9. And typically there's only 2 German boats left after this victory, but I wanted to be a little generous to the Germans, so we have a battleship and 2 cruisers remaining. But before I demonstrate the best way I think to react to this sort of situation, I want to review a couple of themes as the French Navy and 2 caveats. So the 2 themes of the French Navy are 1, protect your transports, and 2, diminish the Central Powers navies. Everything else is secondary. If you're protecting your transports and destroying Central Powers boats, then you're doing good enough as the French Navy. And one of the 2 caveats I want to cover is if the Austro-Hungarians did not push into Sea Zone 17 or were otherwise destroyed by the Italian Navy. If this sea zone is clear on France's first turn, one of these transports absolutely should load up an infantry and move into Sea Zone 17 and unload into Albania. This activates Italy's 3 infantry and artillery therein. These can then be used to attack an adjacent territory or load up those 4 pieces on the French and Italian transport in Sea Zone 17. The other caveat is if the Germans were passive or lost the U-boat battle and have no cruisers up in Sea Zone 9. In that case, you should absolutely take the transport from Sea Zone 15, move it into Sea Zone 14, and activate Portugal. So barring those 2 caveats, if you face some situation like this with CP boats basically all around you, my recommended move is the following. The easiest move first is the French infantry in Morocco moves into Spanish Morocco and picks up an IPC for France. Next, we're going to move the Tunisian infantry into Libya, It's not on screen here, but the infantry in French West Africa should move to the Gold Coast if there's no German in it. Otherwise, it should hold its ground. And finally, we're going to load up this Algerian infantry onto a transport in C-Zone 16. And then both fleets from C-Zone 15 and 16 are going to move to C-Zone 2. At first glance, this move will seem very bizarre. Why did we load up an infantry out of Africa just to move it over to C-Zone 2? Why do we have so much naval firepower out here when there's only a single German submarine? And the problem with moving a transport on turn 1 into C-Zone 14 and activating Portugal is that these German cruisers are in range. It's important to know the rules of naval combat and Axis and Allies 1914, and what the Germans can do is simply move one of these cruisers down into C-Zone 14, not engage in combat and create a hostile C-Zone, which would prevent the loading of any of those French transports on French turn 2. There are other ways to solve this problem with Portugal as France, but this move, in my opinion, has the best in terms of guaranteed results. So let me highlight some of the benefits of this move. First, there's a 93% chance we destroy this German submarine. It's not 100% because the French would have a single round of combat to sink this German boat, and if they didn't, it can submerge. And I'll just say for the record that if 2 German submarines survived that initial battle with the British in C-Zone 2, there's only a 67% chance that the French destroy both boats in that single round of combat. The other thing I like about this move is that because we loaded a French infantry onto a transport, we're virtually guaranteed to be able to move into C-Zone 14 on turn 2 and unload. And the last thing I like about it is that we're all grouped up over here. So even if we take a hit or two off of the German submarines, we're likely safe from the German fleet on the following turn. So just to review, this move is in keeping with our 2 main themes of the French Navy, protecting our transports and diminishing the capabilities of the CP navies. And it's also well on its way to solving the Portugal problem on turn 2. From this position, the French can deploy further into the Atlantic to take care of the Germans, or come back south into the Mediterranean if the Austro-Hungarians need to be taken care of. If you're playing a savvy and aggressive Central Powers player that performs something like these opening moves, there's a lot of variability in results. So I'll say I'm not married to this move, I just lay this one out because it's such a common opener, given the statistics and probabilities of the opening CP moves for their navies. Finally, as mentioned earlier, if you have a 2 infantry per turn snake of French infantry moving towards the Italian front, the French Navy in the mid to late game should be relocated to the Mediterranean. With 2 battleships and plenty of transports, 2 infantry can be plucked off of Piedmont and dropped off anywhere from Albania to Smyrna to Egypt. And with those 2 battleships in tow, it can make for quite a potent amphibious assault. There's no set-piece strategy behind that move. It's just incredibly difficult to contend with such firepower when you're the Central Powers. And since that fleet can hit so many different territories, it's quite potent. I'm now going to transition to a brief discussion on long-range strategies as the Entente. To be the Entente is to be in control of much of the board economy at the start of the game, and the reality is we don't need to win the game out here. The French, the Italians, and the Americans, they only need to hold back the Germans and the Austrians. In my experience playing this game many times, it's best to think of the West Front and the Italian front as an anvil. And if the French and the Italians and the Americans are the anvil out here, then the British are the hammer swinging out of India through Persia into the Ottoman Empire to come up from the rear of the Austro-Hungarians. And this, in my experience, is where most of the wins come from for the Entente. And to that end, that's why I recommend the 8 infantry purchase. By massing infantry out on the West and Italian fronts, it's very difficult for the Central Powers to gain any momentum. And in my experience, this is the most assured way of securing the Entente win. That's feed the fronts in the West Front with infantry, and let the British hammer through the Ottomans in the southeast corner of the map. I'll talk more about this strategy in the next video, the strategic video for the UK. So we'll do a review and then close this video. This was my recommended opener for France's first turn. After a max infantry build, I recommend pushing everybody closer to the Germans on the West Front. I then spent time reviewing best opening moves for the French Navy, namely relocating the fleet to C-Zone 2, but I also covered some options available if the Central Powers navies were more conservative or less successful in their opening moves. Finally, I closed with a brief synopsis of the overall Entente strategy, that is, the anvil of the Western Front followed by the hammer of the British out of India. This concludes the French video. Thanks for watching this. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.